Support for Wavemakers comes from listeners like you and the Tampa Bay Times. The Pulitzer Prize-winning newspaper is available around the Tampa Bay area and online at tampabay.com. Thanks to the Tampa Bay Times for their support.
Good morning and welcome to Wavemakers with Tom and Janet, a weekly conversation with people making a difference in the Tampa Bay region. I'm Janet.
And I'm Tom.
And running the board today is vintage Tampa resident John Dunn. Answering the phones are Edgar and Marilyn. They're double teaming us, so don't worry about overwhelming the phone lines. Feel free to call 813-239-9663. They'll get you through to us. You can also email us at dj@wmnf.org or text us at 813-433-0885. We're happy to be here with you today. And WMNF's Spring Fund Drive begins tomorrow at 9 a.m. with Democracy Now! We on Wavemakers will be raising money next Tuesday, February 27th. We have some really awesome special thank you gifts just for Wavemakers fans. You can see them by going to the Wavemakers page at WMNF.org or just do a search for Wavemakers WMNF. The thank you gifts include a beautiful Tampa International Airport model plane. It's 2 feet long by 2 feet wide on a lovely mahogany base. Perfect for aviation enthusiasts. We also have a couple of coffee table books, one by the conservation photographer and Carlton Ward Jr., who has been on our show a couple times. It's called Path of the Panther. And the other is a collection of 50 stories by nearly 50 Florida authors, published by Florida Humanities, called Once Upon a Time in Florida. Authors include a couple of previous Wavemakers, including Bill Maxwell and Gary Marmino, and today's guest. We hope you will support your favorite community radio station and all the programming it offers beginning tomorrow.
Today's guest has been making waves as an arts and entertainment journalist for decades. Bill DeYoung is currently senior writer and editor at St. Pete Catalyst. He is the author of 5 books, including Skyway, the true story of Tampa Bay's signature bridge, and the man who brought it down, Phil Germhard. Thank you. The Lost Music Interviews, and 3 volumes of Vintage St. Pete. Welcome to Wavemakers, Bill.
Hello there, Tom. Thanks for having me today. I wanted to just say that Carlton Ward is an amazing artist, and that Path of the Panther stuff of his is just totally knocked me out.
Incredible.
Yeah,
really incredible.
I hope you will give us a generous donation, and you can get that as a gift.
Yes, that's. I heard Jenna talking about that, and that's where I'm headed with it.
We're going to hold you in the studio until you donate.
It's a beautiful, beautiful book.
Maybe we can trade up for a copy of Vintage St. Pete, Volume 3.
Bill's journalism career started at age 17 when he was a correspondent for the St. Petersburg Times. His most recent book is Snapshots and Stories from Days Gone By. It's 25 chapters, and the book documents such traditions and legends as the annual Festival of States Parade, the world-famous Kapok Tree Inn, Ted Peters' famous smoked fish house, and on and on. Bill, you've written a lot about music. You wrote a book about the Sunshine Skyway disaster, and we'll get to all of that. But first, let's talk about this series, Vintage St. Pete.
Sure, yeah.
3 books. What sparked your interest in St. Pete history, and how did this series come about?
Well, I returned to St. Petersburg, which is my hometown, 10 years ago.
You grew up in St. Pete.
I grew up in St. Pete. So what was happening was it was changing so fast and so profoundly that, I think one starts to kind of remember, slow life in St. Pete. And because I have a sort of an eye on history anyway, thinking about the things that had been happening while I was growing up, and the people and the places and the things, the events that were important to us and part of daily life, most of which were long gone. And it occurred to me that if somebody needed to write it all down. And it's the same thing that happened with the Skyway Bridge book. I was just frustrated by not being able to find enough information. What was the story of Tiki Gardens? Who were those people and how did they do it? I remembered the Johns Pass Aquarium where they had a dolphin in a 25-foot wide concrete tank when I was a kid. 12 feet deep. It's a long story. It was pretty sad stuff. And I would go online and, hey, what was all this about? And you'd find a paragraph. It was just kind of receding into history. Well, I like the idea of kind of informing people, whoever wants to know about it, this is what life was like in St. Petersburg before. And along the way, I found a lot of things that I had never heard of that happened, say, in the 50s or earlier. And there were certain historical incidents like Tony Jannus flying across the bay to Tampa. You know, I wrote the story of Albert Whittet, for whom our airport is named in St. Petersburg. Historical things that had to be done. Mostly it had to do with kind of giving a place in history to things that were very important to people who lived there for a long time. Plus, it's a lot of fun.
If you live long enough, the stuff that people consider history is actually the stuff that you lived through, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, I've been around a little while here, Tom, and so, you know, first of all, I think the first book has, you know, the story of the Suncoast Seabird Sanctuary and Ralph Heath, who was a friend of mine in the 70s, and you know, people don't know about that. Or Dr. Paul Bearer, who was on WTOG Channel 44, the longest-running horror movie TV host in American history.
I didn't realize he was in St. Pete.
He was WTOG. I don't remember where the studio was, but he was in St. Pete a lot. And, I mean, a lot of this is Tampa Bay stuff. One of the stories that's in the newest book has to do with WTVT, which was the CBS affiliate in those days when we had 3 channels. And it was, you know, it was on Kennedy Boulevard. And so all these guys, Ernie Lee, who did the morning show, played a guitar and sang, Salty Saul Flashman, the sports editor, Roy Leap, who only passed away a few years ago.
Right.
God bless you, Roy. Andy Hardy, sports. This was the #1 station in all of Tampa Bay for 25 years. Okay, so I wrote a story, Shock Armstrong, the guy in the Frankenstein mask who hosted the Friday night, you know, cheeseball horror movie fest. So that's nostalgic to a lot of people. But it was also, when I was a kid, those guys were like our local heroes, you know. And so I went looking for information on them. You find people who knew them, who work with them, family members, and we can talk about that. And we sort of say, here's who they were. You know, Captain Mac was a guy who had a children's show from the old St. Petersburg Pier, live for 15 minutes every weekday afternoon. My sister, one of my sister Patty, was on that show when she was 6, I think. Long gone, but tons of people remember that guy. I found his son, who's a police detective somewhere, and he's Captain Mac is long past, but it was sort of like that. It was like, let's give renewed life to these things. And you know,
that was back when it was kind of a small town, St. Pete and Tampa.
St. Pete was very slow and sleepy.
And they probably had their own, you know, a local children's show.
Sure.
Local TV. You know, they had championship wrestling, right?
Yeah, that's in the future, I think, for me. But one of the things that one of my favorite stories, I think it's in the second book in volume 2, the second book, Bill, is about celebrity dinner theaters.
Oh, yes.
Which in the 1970s and through the 80s.
In the 80s, yeah.
There was nothing else to do in St.
Showboat
Petersburg.
Dinner Theater, that was
the
big
Showboat,
deal.
Dow
The Tampa
Sherwood.
Tribune would actually have their theater critic review their
So
shows.
did the Times.
Yeah.
So did the Times. And the Times critics, God love them, hated every show at the Showboat and at the Country Dinner Playhouse, which was the other one. And these
They
were,
kept going back for more.
oh my God, this was. And I talked to actors who worked in the cast with these sort of, you know, faded TV people who were the big celebs that would come in, and they said people would get dressed up. This was a night out in St. Petersburg, and it was what you did because you know you didn't really have that much to do. It was a very sleepy town, but it was huge for a long time, and I got to find out who was nice to work with, who was kind of a bastard, you know, lovely stuff. And you had like Myrna Loy. Like film stars would come through. You know, Myrna Loy was there, Dorothy Lamour, people like that, in addition to the cast of the Brady Bunch and Gilligan's Island and, you know, and Chuck Connors. I wish I'd seen Chuck Connors, but that was kind of before my time.
If you're just tuning in and you're listening to Wave Makers on WMNF, and our guest is Bill DeYoung, and right now we're talking about his series of books, Vintage St. Pete. Give us a call, 813-239-9663, or send an email at dj@wmnf.org, and maybe share your favorite story of Vintage St. Pete and see if you can ask a question of Bill, see if it's something he's written about. There are in these 3 books, 70-some stories.
The 3 books have a total of 69 stories. I think I've written 7 or 8 more since then that have been published in the Catalyst.
In the Catalyst, because it's a series called Vintage St. Pete.
Well, then
How often do you run it?
As often as I kind of feel like.
Let's explain the Catalyst.
I can do it. Yeah, okay.
St. Pete Catalyst is an online news site. We actually had the owner of the Catalyst on as one of our early wave makers.
Joe Hamilton. Yeah, it's an online news platform. And
you came down here to work for them?
Well, I came down here. I was born and raised in St. Pete, and I lived in Gainesville for 22 years. I was the arts editor for the Gainesville Sun. Got divorced and moved around the state a little bit, got remarried. Hi, Amy. And ended up back here about 10 years ago, thinking I was out of journalism, that I'd sort of had enough. I'd written the Skyway book and thinking I've kind of done what I need to do. I don't want to go sit in bars and listen to bands anymore. So I took a job in PR and was bored out of my mind, and suddenly I'm a journalist again. Then came Joe Hamilton saying, I'm starting this online business and civic news platform, which I wrote business for 6 months, and I said, this really isn't my thing.
You hate spreadsheets.
I'm an arts. Oh, there's so much, Tom. Don't even get me started. But it also occurred to me, my training and my experience is in arts and entertainment writing. This is what I do. I interview people. I talk about things that are coming. And I just said to Joe, look, the Times has kind of dropped the mantle here. Love you guys. And Creative Loafing does what Creative Loafing does, but there's really no solid arts reporting here in this community, which is blowing up. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of very St. Pete based. I go into Tampa a little bit. I talk about the professional theaters over here because they're doing some amazing work. And of course, the big shows at Emily and the stadiums and all that stuff. I don't really get involved in some of the arts organizations over here. It's very much St. Pete and Pinellas. And so and Joe said, yeah, go ahead. And that was, 6 or 7 years ago. So that's pretty much exclusively what I do.
But then you got in, what was your first vintage St. Pete story?
The first one, I believe, there's a place, there's an area over in West St. Pete on Park Street called Jungle Prada. And it's where Admiral Farragut Academy is, the military school. And in the 1920s, Admiral Farragut Academy was a hotel, and this was Babe Ruth's favorite place to stay. And there was a nightclub down the road. Just down the road, you could get to by trolley, called the Gangplank. Babe Ruth used to drink there and eat lots of hot dogs, apparently. and so I was in there, and it's still going as a place called it's called the Jungle Tavern now. We were in there, and somebody said, during Prohibition, there used to be a tunnel going from Bogosiega Bay into the kitchen of this place, so that they could run hooch into here. And then that got people started talking about Al Capone and the gangsters who had lived here. And so I said, let's find out about this. So I went back in the kitchen with the guy that owns the place. We stomped all over the floor. And he said, there's a hollow place over here. We never could prove it. But then somebody else called and said, they did one of those Mythbusters shows where they found a safe back in a back room here, and they opened it to great fanfare. It was very, very much Geraldo and Al Capone's vault, and there was nothing in it. But there's always been these stories about how Prohibition and gangsters, and the only thing we could prove was true is that Babe Ruth liked the place. And so that was the first story I wrote. And it was kind of the history of Babe Ruth in St. Petersburg, because he was here a lot because of spring training. And
right.
But Capone, no. So that was the first one, and that kind of started it. Then I started looking around going, whatever happened to the Aquatarium? Whatever happened to, as I say, Tiki Gardens, the Bounty, which was moored down at the St. Pete Pier for many, many, many years. And you start looking into who's still around, who is involved with it, and who can tell you about it. And you start reading the archives, and never short of ideas. Let's just put it that way. It just goes on and on.
Lots of history in this area.
Some of them are things that are still... They're not all things that have gone by, though, or gone by the wayside. You write about Ted Peters, which is still here.
Ted's gone, yeah, but his late partner's son is still running the place. And so I got a great history lesson.
I get the feeling it hasn't changed a bit.
Hasn't changed a bit. They still don't take credit cards.
Right.
The neighborhood has changed a lot, but
Sure.
it seems to be exactly the way it was when I first went there 40-something years ago.
There's a lot of that, and I think there's a deep nostalgia for that sort of thing from people who remembered it.
Well, the original Hurricane Lounge, I still have great affection for
Yeah,
that.
sure. I remember going to the Hurricane.
They had jazz in there.
No, that's not what that has not been preserved, though. It's very different.
It's very different.
I haven't been in a long time, so is it?
Yeah, it's touristy now.
There's all the 6 degrees of separation that happens, which is very, very interesting for me. I was working on a book called Phil Gernhardt, Record Man, and Phil was a record producer from Sarasota who had an office in St. Petersburg. Ronnie Elliott was his assistant in those days, after he was still a musician. Phil produced Snoopy versus the Red Baron, which was recorded here on McDill Avenue in Tampa. Okay. Phil discovered and produced Lobo, who's a guy named Kent Lavoie, had a couple of huge hits, Jim Stafford, the Bellamy Brothers from Pasco County. So I wrote a biography of him. And as it turns out, we're getting to why I'm telling you this, Tom, I promise. Across from the Hurricane Lounge, there's a snack bar. And it's on the footer of the old Paso Grill Hotel, which burned down in 1967.
I did not know that that's what was there.
The snack bar was founded and built by Phil Gernhardt.
Oh, I love that snack bar. They have excellent hamburgers there.
Yeah, okay. So before he left for L.A. and went to work for Mike Curb and started producing more and more and more and kind of became international when he was still here. He went to the city council. I found this in the archives. We don't want another boozy... we're not going to sell beer there, folks. I mean, the citizenry, Paso Grill people are very sensitive about what you do out there. But Phil went and argued and won, and he built that place, and he ran it for, 2 years before he left for California.
Fortunately, they serve adult beverages now. So
do they?
They do, and it's actually, the beach has eroded so much, it's like literally waterfront. There's hardly any beach left in front of it.
What are some of your favorite vintage St. Pete store?
Go ahead.
So what sticks out to you of the 70 or so that you've written?
I think what sticks out for me are the ones that I did not know about, that maybe predated me. I was born in 1958, but I found out that in the early 50s, for example, some Broadway-type people, I'm not really sure how they found this place, but got some investors. Let's bring Broadway shows to St. Petersburg. Now, bear in mind, there's no Bayfront Center. There's no auditorium. There's no nothing. This is early 50s. What they did was they put up a circus tent on 4th Street North around 90th somewhere and filled it with bleachers. They put a lot of money into this, and they brought Broadway people down. They put on a whole season of shows with lights and everything. It was called the St. Petersburg Operetta. And at the end of the second season, hurricane winds blew the tent over, and they had to finish in I think it was Northeast High School Auditorium, and then they went looking for a new place, and then what they did was they finished the next season in what became the Gay Blades roller rink over on 9th Avenue North, which is another thing I wrote. It was a roller rink. It was a Quonset hut that hadn't quite reached its potential yet. So they had
Did you used to go roller skating there?
One of my sisters did. Patty did all the time. And
there wasn't a gay bar, the Gay Blades?
No, that old joke, Tom. But
sorry.
But you hear that a lot. So the St. Pete Operetta was absolutely amazing.
God, you even made John laugh. John actually laughed out loud.
Thank you, John. And as I'm digging into the operetta, I find out that on Treasure Island, during the same season, only one season, there was a place called the Treasure Island Music Circus, which is very similar. There was a movement up in the Northeast, I forget exactly what it was called, of doing big productions and bringing them out to the sticks in large tents. And the Music Circus only lasted 1 year. In the company was Elaine Stritch, young Elaine Stritch, future Broadway star. The stage manager was 17-year-old Larry Hagman.
Oh, my gosh.
His mother, of course, was Mary Martin, who was connected in all of this. And that place was a total bust. And the guys who are running it were complaining. And we just don't think St. Petersburg audiences are sophisticated enough to appreciate this kind of entertainment. And they pulled out the operetta lasted a little longer. I love stuff like that.
Okay, well, let's go to the phones. We've got Phil from Palm Beach, all the way from Palm Beach, who's been waiting patiently to speak. Phil from Palm Beach, you are on the line. What is on your mind, sir?
Good day, everybody. Thank you, Making Waves, for another great show. And Bill, thank you for writing all the lovely history about St. Pete.
Well, thanks for that.
St. Pete and Seminole, and I remember the Porpoise Pub had a porpoise.
Yes.
Also, that was a pub on Seminole Boulevard.
Yes, it burned down, and they're putting up a car wash there.
Yes.
Now. Yes.
Because we don't have enough car washes.
Great. Hey, that's the story of my life. You got 10 years on me, but I watched Pinellas County get decimated with tourism and, the influx. But I also remember the aquarium out on St. Pete Beach.
Yeah, the aquatarium, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember Dolly the Sheep in John's Pass, and also Harold's Gun and Knife Club.
Oh, sure. I was in a band in the 70s. We used to play at the Keg and Cork pub right across the street from Harold's.
Oh,
yeah.
But wait, why was there a sheep at John's Pass?
I have no idea what he meant by that.
There are lots of
I still have things to learn, I guess.
Tell us about the sheep at John's Pass.
Well, I can tell you about Jimmy Buffett playing while the Dolly the porpoise was there.
Oh, Dolly the porpoise.
That was the... Yeah,
oh, Dolly was the name of the dolphin at the Porpoise Pub. Yeah. Oh, that's
right. Yeah, I forget the name of the one in John's Pass.
That was Paddy. Paddy.
That's right, Paddy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's another very sad story.
Got to get our porpoises straight.
We won't go into here, but Paddy lived a very sad life there, and at the end of when the aquatarium finally drove the John's Pass Aquarium out of business, the owner, Mr. Hurlburt, sold Paddy to the aquatarium, and he died within a year because he had no social skills. He had to be separated from the other animals because he was aggressive. He lived alone in a 12-foot deep tank for 9 years.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, so people, they thought of them as fish in those days. I mean, it's really sad when you read about the history of the way people treated bottlenose dolphins in those days.
I mean, think about the chimps. All the exotic animal shows and tourist traps throughout the ages.
Oh, yeah.
And I remember Web City and the dancing chickens,
That's true.
I remember when the circus actually still came to town.
Yeah.
And Barnum and Bailey still went to the Bayfront Center.
The circus has become the Americanized Cirque du Soleil now,
Yeah.
No
they
animals.
just had no animals, right? There just was a big circus which is good. It should be.
Well, when I was a kid, we would go down to the Bayfront Center, and the circus would be there every January, and they filmed their TV spectacular because it was so big.
Hey, Bill, do you remember the Haas Museum?
Yes, that's actually it's on my short list of things to look into. I have some notes about the Haas Museum, Haas.
Wow.
Yeah.
What is it? What did the Haas Museum specialize in?
I'm not entirely sure.
Avocados?
It was St. Pete history.
It was a very tiny little place, wasn't it?
It was wonderful, yes.
I have some bookmark stuff about that.
Well, Phil,
try to include that. And
I'll be looking into that one, man. Thank you.
These books.
Thanks, I appreciate you so much, man.
Easy Garden. Hey, great show, great work.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Thanks for calling.
Thank you to this sharp listener who tells me, Jill, thank you, Jill. Dolly the sheep was the cloned sheep from Scotland.
Right.
That's right. Dolly was not at John's Pass. She was the cloned sheep in Scotland. So there we go. Our guest right now is Bill DeYoung. He's the author of 3 books about the history of St. Pete, and he is also a content editor for Catalyst St. Pete. We'll be back with more from him right after this station announcement.
Jazz is alive at WMNF. Tune in Sunday evenings at 8 for Colors of Jazz at our new time, featuring new releases from new artists, old favorites, international jazz from Europe, Asia, and Canada, covering everything from big band swing to bop to fusion. We play it all, plus specials celebrating the music of giants like Ellington, Miles Davis, Pat Metheny, Quincy Jones, Chick Corea, even Frank Zappa. We play the music you'll hear no place else on the radio. Check out our interviews with local jazz musicians. Jazz is what America sounds like, and it's yours to listen to come Sunday evening. If you can't catch us live, play it back from the archives.
There are very few places to listen to jazz on the radio, and WMNF is one of those places. We've got a couple jazz shows, so worth checking out.
And please remember that when we start our fund drive tomorrow.
So, Bill, one of the things that you've written a lot about is filmmaking. So let's talk about the history of filmmaking and then some of the films that have been made in in Pinellas County.
I think first and foremost, people remember Cocoon, which was done in 1984 in St. Pete. So obviously that was one of the first things I did, just to get it on record, and get as many cool photos.
And a good movie, unlike Cop and a Half, which was filmed in Tampa.
Well, that's Tampa. We don't talk about that in Vintage St. Pete
because that's embarrassing.
What we do talk about is Health.
Oh, yeah,
or
Robert Altman.
Health, because there's periods. That Robert Altman filmed at the Don Cesar in 1979, which Ronald Reagan famously screened and called the worst movie ever made.
Huh.
He was not wrong.
Have you seen it?
Cop and a Half.
I kind of want to see it just to see
you
the
can see it on
Benoit.
YouTube. Yeah, it's never been made available in any form at all. Cop and a Half, boy, I tell you what. No, Health was... Altman hadn't really had his big revival yet. This was before The Player and Pret-a-Porter and Shortcuts and all of that. This was, he had done Nashville, and it was and had kind of his reputation had slowly gone down a bit by bit by then. But he took over the Don Cesar for a month, and this is a film that has Lauren Bacall, Carol Burnett, Glenda Jackson, and James Garner. Dick Cavett is in it playing himself. And anyway, the gambit, I'll give it to you very briefly, is a health food convention has taken over this beachside hotel. Guess where? It's pink, folks. Basically the candidates running for presidency of the health food organization are all eccentric weirdos. And it's just so bad. I think Paul Dooley wrote it. He's in it. As much as you can write an Altman script, it was very freeform.
Was this an excuse to stay at the Don Cesar?
I think it might have been. Yeah. I think maybe Dick Cavett said, "Well, I'll do it if you."
Because the Don did go through its own decline. Right?
Oh, that's another story I've done.
Was that during that period of time?
No, it was just coming out of its decline then. I think for most of the. For most of the 70s, it was kind of
pre-World War II. It was the place to be.
It was a place to be, and then it was, it was taken over by the military. It was a convalescent hospital, and then it became a government building, and then it was shuttered. But by the time I think the revival had started, if you look at Health, it looks pretty good. It looks pretty healthy. Yeah. But this movie, I don't know if you guys know Roy Peter Clark, who's a writer over at Pointer, but Roy was I want to say a Cub reporter. Roy was a reporter at the Times, and he covered health extensively. Roy's a friend of mine. And so he sat in a room and interviewed Lauren Bacall. Roy named his daughter named her Lauren.
Oh, wow.
Happily tell you that. But Roy told me that he could tell, because Altman liked him and would invite him into what they call the rushes, to watch what they'd filmed. And Roy said he could tell by watching it that it was going to suck. He said, and so and so it literally, I think it played at a couple of film festivals and on TV once, which is where the recording on YouTube came from, and nobody's seen it since. So that was a great story. And so I would talk to people who were extras, who were around while it was filming. I found tons of photographs. I talked to Roy. I went into the archives of what was being written at the time, what the stars said, or didn't say. That was that. And of course,
and there have been also lots of attempts to create movie studios.
That happened all over Florida. They were determined to make this Hollywood South. I think this started in Jacksonville. The primarily African-American studio was up there. Right this second, I can't remember what it was called. There's a whole museum dedicated to this right now. They tried to do it in South Florida. They certainly tried to do it here. Whedon Island had a very briefly movie studio that Buster Keaton was very briefly involved with.
Did they make any movies there?
They made 3 films. They're all terrible. One is called Chloe, now available as Chloe, Love is Calling You on a really bad DVD transfer. The second one is called Playthings of Desire. And the third one is called Hired Wife. And Only Hired Wife, it's not the Rosalind Russell film. Only Hired Wife is the one that you can't get these days. And I have seen most of it. I've seen sections of it and read all about it. But so that was early. And they tried to do that in Florida, sort of because of the balmy climate. You can make films year round.
Right.
Of course, everything went to California eventually.
Right.
That's what happened. One of the things I did discover working on filmmaking here is that in, I want to say 1946, they shot scenes for a Bogart film, a film noir called Dead Reckoning here. It's Bogart and Lisbeth Scott, who is one of the femme fatales of the time. So if you see it, they drive through St. Petersburg. I don't think they call it St. Petersburg. It's a beachfront town, you know. And then you see them on what is the Treasure Island Causeway and driving. Then there's a beach scene with that beach in the background. They were never here. What they did was they sent the second unit out here to get, they shot body doubles in the car from behind and from the side. And Bogart and Scott were never here. And then they did that sort of rear screen projection thing to have them on the causeway. A reporter for the Times named Betty Orsini, who sadly left us now, was Lisbeth Scott's body double. So she wrote a story about it in 1946. You know, I was Bogart's mole. They hadn't even cast Lisbeth Scott yet. So there's things like that were just amazing to me. And they filmed a couple of TV movies here. They shot scenes for Bang the Drum Slowly in Clearwater with Robert De Niro. And so I thought all this kind of stuff just should be documented in one place. The Dolphin Tale movies, you know. It goes on
that
and
was
on.
a big one.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Spring Breakers with
Spring
Selena
Breakers.
Gomez, who is so big now. So
Yeah, Spring Breakers was, I think, 2012, I want to say, out on St. Pete Beach, and that was a huge thing. There's just some...
also not a great movie. Cocoon may be the best.
Well, I think that maybe it's for a different generation than ours.
no, I don't think
perhaps.
that was it, Bill.
Yeah, well,
But that's
okay.
nice
I didn't
of
want to
you.
say that, but okay.
And we talked a little bit about Ted Peters, but what about some other restaurants? What are some other famous... And now, Ted Peters is still here, but things that have come and gone.
They say, it's the famous they, that the Cape Octree Inn was once the most popular restaurant in Florida. They could serve 1,200 people at a time.
That was in Clearwater.
Yes.
Yep.
It's right there on McMullen Booth Road, where it's the Sam Ash Music Store now.
Right, became a music store.
The Sam Ash Music Store is kind of the entryway to what was the Cape Octree Inn. There's an event planning place that's in there now, and they do really good work. It's all been preserved very, very well. 12 different really ornate dining rooms, all decorated very differently with Roman statuary and
Right.
live sconces. And it was in those days of celebrity dinner theater, for example. This was a big night out. You'd go to the Cape Octree. Never went there. My parents never took me there. You know, our big night out for me was the Ponderosa Steakhouse.
We
on
went
US
there
19.
when we first moved here. We
Did
the
you?
showboat. We went to the Cape 94th Aero Squadron. Do you remember that
By the
restaurant?
Clearwater Airport.
At the Clearwater Airport.
No.
Okay, there's one. Put that in your tickler file.
Yeah.
That was an interesting one. That was at the St. Pete
Tickler file.
Clearwater
I'm using
Airport.
that one. The Cape Octree, it was a guy named Richard Baumgartner, who had been, I think he was a musician. I think he was a big band leader or something, and had come down from Baltimore, I think, and set this place up. And they opened a fancy restaurant across the street. I think it was called Baumgartner's, and he passed away. And in time, his wife donated to the city of Clearwater the land that Ruth Eckerd Hall was built on, which is why the main hall at Ruth Eckerd is called the Richard Baumgartner Auditorium, I think. So, yeah.
So one of the subjects that you have spent a lot of time studying is the Sunshine Skyway disaster in 1980.
Yeah.
Which was such a long time ago, but there's still a lot of people here who vividly remember that day. It was my first week in Tampa writing for the Tampa Times, and I remember pulling into the parking lot of the newsroom about, 7 o'clock that morning, because it was an afternoon newspaper. That was a newspaper that was published and delivered to your homes in the afternoon, children.
Remember those
For
days?
I don't remember that.
Oh, yeah. We had the Evening Independent.
And I had the
over in
radio
St.
on, and they said, a ship has hit the Skyway. And I thought, I wonder what that is.
Yeah.
And I soon found out
You
when I got
soon
into the
found
newsroom,
out.
it was insane. But what drew you to that story?
Oh, that that's an easy.
That was your
one.
first book.
That was my first book. It's 10 years old now. It came out in 2013. That was easy. I was living in Savannah at the time, and I suppose there was an anniversary, as there often is. It was on the 9th of May, 1980. And I was reading about it online because I was 22, I think, when it happened. I remember it very well. And it occurred to me that every time somebody wrote about it, some of the information was different. I'm a journalist. Wait, what's the real story here? And it occurred to me that the people were being a little bit, flip about it. And as it passed into history, the information got more muddied, And so I said, okay, always looking for a project to do. And somehow I just glommed onto this. Let's find out what really actually happened. So I went into the archives. I found everybody I could who was still alive, including the co-pilot, Bruce Atkins, who lives in Massachusetts. I flew up and spent a weekend with him and his wife. He was there when it happened. He was right there on the ship. I got all the trial testimony, which is thousands and thousands of pages. I got all the reports from the NTSB, the Coast Guard, all the trial coverage, and basically just lived this thing for 2.5 years.
The trial went on for a while, didn't it?
It did. Well, it wasn't actually a trial. It was a hearing.
It was a hearing.
Yeah, and Stephen Yared, who we all know here in Tampa, was Captain Laro's attorney, defense attorney, and he, to his credit, put on a brilliant defense, and it really made his career. Hey, Steve. So I did that. I'm very, very proud of it.
But one of the things that you have drew from that is you feel like John Laro's reputation never recovered from that, even though he was found not guilty he was not complicit in that. It was
right.
What did they find?
Not negligent. Both the NTSB and the Coast Guard included as kind of an addendum to their findings that he might have acted more prudently in the face of what happened. This storm came on him very, very suddenly. It was not predicted by the National Weather Service. I have all the National Weather Service.
He was the ship that he was.
He was half a mile from the Skyway when this thing just unloaded on him. There are lots of extenuating circumstances here. One of the things that kind of irritated me, if I may, and irritates me to this day, is that still on social media, people will say, "Oh yeah, that captain was drunk." Well, John, first of all, didn't drink. Second of all, this happened at 7:30 in the morning, and he'd been under that bridge almost 1,000 times. He was a professional, So you still hear this stuff. I did not set out to rescue this man's reputation. I didn't know him, but what I found out was that he wasn't at fault. And yeah, it ruined him. It totally ruined him. Within a year, he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, which is triggered by stress. Of course, it was probably in him the whole time. It eventually killed him. It's a very, very sad story, but it wasn't his fault. And I think that people should look into it and see what actually happened. I spent a lot of time with the family of Wes McIntyre, who was the gentleman whose car went down with the bridge and literally ricocheted off the hull of the ship and sank. And he was the lone survivor. 35 people perished, and Wes, who has passed away, but I spent a lot of time with his wife and his daughter. His wife, Betty, has since passed away.
Now, all of these folks perished because the vehicles they were in went off the bridge.
Yeah, 150 feet.
Today, if the winds get to a certain point, they close the Skyway.
Right.
So I've been wondering, how is it that they just let... Oh, yeah, that looks fine.
It was 1980, Tom.
Yeah.
I think when you look at all the safety gadgets, if you will, they installed after this happened when they put up what we still call the new bridge, even though it's been up since 1987. A lot of it had to do with a warning system. It had to do with those bumpers they put up. It had to do with the fact that they moved the bridge 1,000 feet to the east because of this really awkward turn that ships had to take to stay in the channel and go under the bridge. So they knocked that out. But a lot of it had to do with, there were no lights. There was no warning on the bridge. All they had was radar. And plus, for drivers, there were no lights on that bridge ever.
And to your point, the storm came up very quickly.
Sure.
Right. It kind of out of nowhere.
Sure. I mean, the National Weather Service issued the report about watch for this squall an hour after it hit. That's how fast this happened. And if you remember that morning, it was blowing like a bandit, as Guy Clark used to say. It was insane.
So at that point, he had very little choice. He had to either try to stop the ship,
Which you can't do,
right,
or
go for it.
His radar blipped on for a second. The radar was in and out, and Captain Atkins says, "I see the channel. We're right where we need to be. Start your turn." It's an 18-degree turn to port, and he did that. And also, the other extenuating thing was that there was an oil tanker outbound from Tampa that was right on the other side of the bridge. He had lost contact with him when the storm came up. He thought Lero could have gone, essentially made a U-turn in the channel and avoided the bridge, but he didn't know where the tanker was.
Because he couldn't see it.
Couldn't see it, and the radar was going out. And as it turned out, which my research kind of uncovered, the captain of the tanker never broadcast the fact that he had pulled over to let the storm beat itself out. He had grounded himself on the other side. He never told Lero this, which is the sad truth. And there's a lot of people who are involved in the Harbor Pilots Association who have strong opinions about what happened there. But it wasn't Lero. And Lero took the brunt of the blame, and still all these years later he's been dead for quite a while now. They still say, oh, it's his fault. It wasn't his fault. Terrible set of, what do we call it, like bad mojo all coming together at the same time in the same place.
Perfect storm.
So in 2015, though, you took your work on the Skyway to another level and organized a memorial that was placed.
We put up a memorial out there at the rest area. It's near the Blackthorn Memorial. The Blackthorn tragedy of 1980 plays kind of into this story, too. So it's right there.
Explain that.
Well, on the 20th of January, 1980, the Coast Guard cutter Blackthorn, which is a small vessel, was coming out of a dry dock in Tampa on its way to Galveston about 7 at night. And as it passed under the Skyway, it got rammed. It got rammed by an incoming freighter, and it sank in, I think, 4 minutes, and 23 crewmen drowned. It is still, to this day, the worst peacetime disaster in Coast Guard history. The pilots refer to that area as the combat zone because this is before they changed it. Everything comes together at the same time. It plays into it simply because Blackthorn was left where it was for several weeks until they raised it. I have the video footage of them raising it. It's harrowing stuff. And one of the ships that was having to come through, they had to move around it to go under the bridge to get to the port of Tampa. Very, very, at that time, the 7th busiest port in the country. And one of the ships was trying to go around it. It's
keel or
the stern. I'm sorry, I can't think of the words. I've been out of the maritime business for a while now, so it takes me a minute. The stern swung around and clipped one of the main supports and knocked a little sheet of concrete off of it. No serious damage was caused.
I didn't even know about that.
Yeah, but and it continued on to the port. John Lero was the pilot of that ship. So when the Skyway thing came out, oh my God, he hit it before. I still have the NBC Nightly News. It's Jane Pauley saying, it turns out the pilot who knocked the Skyway Bridge down had hit the bridge before. And they brought up everything that had ever happened to him. He had fewer accident reports than anybody else on the bar, on the Harbor Pilots bar.
Well, so not only did you create that memorial, but you also wrote a play about John Lero, right?
I did. Yeah, I wrote a one-man first-person show. I didn't act in it because I can't act. Brilliant actor from St. Pete named Michael Horn did it. It's called Mayday, Captain Lero on the Skyway Bridge. And essentially for 75 minutes, he sits there and tells you what he went through. And it's pretty harrowing stuff. And we did some video. And a lot of it was taken from his testimony. A lot of it was taken from, the testimony of others, people who told me about him and the kinds of things he said.
So interesting. You're very fascinated with him. Why the fascination with him?
Well, I think the memorial came about probably just because the state of Florida, to my understanding, wanted to pretend this thing never happened. When I started writing to Tallahassee in 2014, saying, "Can't we do something about this?"
Because they already had a memorial to the Blackthorn.
The Coast Guard put it up, an absolutely beautiful thing, and I thought we should honoring the people, the 35 innocents who died. That I was ignored. I was totally ignored. And when I went, they said, well, somebody said, this is Department of Transportation property. You got to go through them. And I took forever and finally got them to say, okay, well, if you pay for it and you indemnify us in case we have to move it. So they have a lot of my money sitting in sort of an escrow account in case they have to move it, which they haven't had to do yet. Anyway, so we did that. We had a big ceremony on the 40th anniversary in 2015, 35th anniversary. Oh, my goodness.
We've got, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to Wavemakers on WMNF with Janet and Tom, and our guest is Bill DeYoung. He's written 3 books about the history of St. Pete, as well as a book about the Skyway disaster, and also Phil
It's
Gernhardt.
It's Gernhardt.
Record man.
We're going to reissue this book
Phil
this year, and I think we're going to take.
you are?
I think we're going to take his name out of the title, so this doesn't happen
Nobody can
anymore.
pronounce
Are we
it.
the only? We're not the only ones who do that. Good.
No.
So we've been talking about. I want to get to a couple emails because people liked our conversation about restaurants. So we have Rick Albert who mentioned Pepin's, which was a great restaurant. I think that Pepin's was the Spanish restaurant.
It was on 4th Street.
Oh,
Sure.
Is that where it was?
That
Yeah.
great
Pepin's.
sangria.
Yep.
Yeah.
Which has closed, and then someone else also says that you should look into 94th Aero Squadron and
Well, now
the
that's
boatyard.
what did you
94th
call
Aero-
that? The whisper list, or what did you call
The tickler
the
file.
tickler file? I like that.
And then, yeah,
Old newspaper term.
Old newspaper term. So those were other places that people were interested in.
I'm only familiar with the circular file from my newspaper days.
Tell us about the lost music interviews.
It's called I Need to Know, the Lost Music Interviews. I Need to Know being the title of a song by Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. I lived in Gainesville for 22 years, as I said. And when I got there, I've always been a music person. Sports doesn't interest me at all. It kind of never has. And, with all due respect, the Florida Gators were everything there. And when I got there, I said, what about Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers? And this was long before the Traveling Wilburys and long before Tom became Mr. Giant Music Guy. And everybody from the band was from Gainesville. And so literally I got to know them when they'd come through town and wrote about them a lot, did lots of lengthy interviews with Tom. Not that I can't say we were friends or anything like that, but I always get kind of special dispensation because of where I was and who I was writing for. So I Need to Know, and I also wrote for a music magazine called Goldmine. It's a record collecting magazine that I will say now used to be good. I haven't seen them lately, but they used to. I wrote like 10,000 word interviews with people. I did lengthy interviews with Linda Ronstadt.
Oh, cool.
And people like that. I did a lengthy interview with George Martin, the Beatles producer. Being a Beatles nut, that was the pinnacle for me. And I literally spent a day writing questions out. What did I always want to know? Rather than just like shoot from the hip and ask them stupid stuff. Still, my favorite interview I've ever done. That's what this book is. It collects all these. There are 4 interviews with Petty. They're all very long. There's 2 interviews with Neil Young, who's another favorite artist of mine. And I can't remember how many, but there's a lot of that. And Goldmine, I own the rights to that. I went back to the actual Petty interviews that I did. I still had the cassettes, transcribed them all. There's one we did after he'd played with Bob Dylan in Madison Square Garden in '86. Right after the show, we just sat down in his hotel room and talked for an hour and a half.
Oh, that's awesome.
And so a lot of this stuff nobody had ever seen. Oh, screw it, man. Let's put it out. Put a book out. So that's what we did.
Cool. We got a couple calls, so let's go to the phones. Kenny from Clearwater. You are on the line. What's up?
Did you ever hear about the story about Saturday Night Live getting sued over the skit they did about the Skyway Bridge?
Well, they actually, it's actually in the book. They actually didn't get sued, but they took a lot of, let's say, flack for it.
Backlash, and
there was a big thing in the Times back in the day.
What they say? They said, "This is what Florida does for toll dodgers."
I can almost quote it verbatim. The St. Petersburg Highway Authority had to close the Tampa Bay Bridge today when a driver refused to pay the toll, and there was a picture of Mr. Hornbuckle's yellow Buick hanging on the edge there.
Oh man!
And it's a clip when I do presentations about the Skyway. And
that
show
showed on the front page of the New York Times the next day.
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
used to work for the Tampa Bay Times?
I was a correspondent for the Times when I was 17, 18 years old and wrote a lot of
my
concert
friend
reviews.
used to work there. I think he was an editor, Larry Fletcher.
Oh, sure. I remember that name, yeah.
Larry, yeah. We played lacrosse together for the Tampa Bay Lacrosse Club.
Larry worked at the Tampa Tribune, and I worked with him.
There you go.
Yeah. Yeah.
Old journalists never die. They just write books. Thanks for calling.
Yeah.
In Larry's case, he's publishing military magazines.
There you go.
Thanks for the call. Appreciate it very much. So where can people, well, let's go back to this because you knew Tom Petty or you talked to him. Were you surprised at the way he died? I was surprised. I was kind of surprised by that.
Well, I'll tell you my view on Tom, and I'll do it in an expeditious way. I'm looking at the clock here. He changed a lot after the Traveling Wilburys, after he changed the people he started associating with. I was very into the Heartbreakers as a unit, as a group.
Well, you were in Gainesville.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I could see that changing, not only by his attitude and the way he talked, and then he fired Stan Lynch, the drummer, who was a great big part of why the Heartbreakers were great. And Stan is still a friend of mine, and I love him to death. And to me, that was like Petty didn't care anymore. In the early days, he would always talk about the Heartbreakers as us, and then it became me. He became a big, for lack of a better phrase, an L.A. rock star. I literally, in the mid-'90s, stopped trying to talk to him. It's like, I just don't care anymore. Moved on.
Interesting.
So was I surprised? Not really.
That's sad.
Yeah. And tell us, how can people access your books?
Many of them are on Amazon. Most of them are on Amazon under my name, and also the ones that are published in St. Petersburg, which is the Vintage St. Pete books, and I Need to Know, you can get through stpetersburgpress.com. Tom Blow Books in St. Petersburg has, I think, all of them. Okay. Tom Blow Books,
Yay, Tom Blow, they do good work.
Yeah, hey guys. Yeah.
So I did want to ask you, because we only have a few minutes left here, how did you become a correspondent for the St. Pete Times at 17? Did you just walk in and say, hey, I want to write for you guys? And say, okay, sure.
Well, I had an in, I'll tell you. My sister had been a writer there. She's now at the Washington Post. She's actually been at the Washington Post for almost 50 years now, but
yeah, it's incredible.
She was a reporter, and so I just knew people there. I was her kid brother.
This was before she posted all the salaries of all the reporters?
It was after. She was still there.
She was still there.
Yeah,
incredible.
she went on to bigger and better things. So it really was, I got to know, I don't know if you know Bob Ross, who went on to write for the Tribune.
A friend of him.
Yeah, okay. Well, Bob was the music writer at the Times. And for better, for worse, hey, Bob, I love you, Bob.
He's probably listening.
I hope so. I glommed on to Bob, and I got a job as a copy boy in the office. There.
Oh, that's how I started.
Oh, there you go. Running coffee and taking the
they
copy.
They were later called editorial assistants, but yes.
An editorial assistant.
We called them copy kids, actually.
And basically, I guess what I did was just pestered Bob no end. And finally, he said, well, can you write? And I said, I think so. And he said, look, I don't want to go to Lakeland to see Queen or whatever it was. How about you go?
Oh my God!
And that's how it started. And then I started writing the occasional feature.
So that was your first concert review?
I'm not sure. No, it might have been Earth, Wind, and Fire, but it was great. Bob would send me to Lakeland, and I think, God bless him, he just didn't want to make the drive.
Yeah.
Let the kid do it. But it was Earth, Wind, and Fire when they would come down in the big spaceship, and it was tremendous.
And did you have to write that on deadline?
Yes. Well, you learn quick. As you know, you learn quick.
That's the word. I was a music writer. When you have to write you're writing a concert review on deadline, and the paper's, you have to write your review 15 minutes before the show ends.
Well, you have to write it during the show, right?
Well, you certainly have to have it in your mind where you're going with it. I mean, it's a lot easier now to do something on deadline, but in those days, and being young and stupid, I mean, I actually have a file with some clips in it. I just said, Ted Nugent was the worst thing I'd ever seen, and Ted Nugent's mother sent me a nasty card in the mail.
Wow! And this was, of course, before the days of laptops, and, or even probably electric typewriters.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was fun going down to the Times building at 11 o'clock at night. Hey, but here we are.
Yeah. Well, Bill, thanks for being here. Remind everybody again where they can get your books.
Tom Blow Books in St. Petersburg, Amazon.com for most of them, and stpetersburgpress.com for the Vintage St. Pete books. And I Need to Know the Lost Interviews. And thank you. I hope you'll check them out.
Yeah, people who have ideas for some of the Vintage St. Pete stories, can they contact you through St. Pete Catalyst?
Yeah, through the Catalyst. I also have a website, which is BillDeYoung.com. And it's probably easier to go through the Catalyst.
What's going to be your next Vintage St. Pete story?
I have no idea.
No?
The next story I'm writing?
The next story you're working
on.
The
Suncoast Playboy Club, which was down in the Hilton Hotel in 1981 and 82.
Huh.
I'm supposed to be meeting with some former bunnies soon to tell me all about it.
Well, and there's something online about the shuffleboard courts right now.
I did the shuffleboard courts a few weeks ago. That was fun. I did the whole history of Derby Lane recently. It never ends.
You'll have to write something about how St. Pete became a center for hipsters.
I think it always was. Go read the Beaux Arts story. St. Pete was the...
That's true. Jack Kerouac. I mean, that's true.
It was the epicenter for hipsters for oddballs and weirdos and bohemians.
But by the time Kerouac showed up, he was just a drunken...
Tom Reese threw him out. Nobody drinks in my establishment. Threw him out. That's the place where Jim Morrison read his poetry, and that's a famous story. And that's in that one, and that's in this book, Vintage 3.
So Vintage St. Pete. Check it out by Bill DeYoung. Thanks for being here. John, Vintage John, thank you for running our board. And thanks to Edgar and Marilyn for answering the phone.
Tune in next week for our Spring Fun Drive.
Up next is American Radio, followed by Alternative Radio, followed by Harrison Nash. This is WMNF Tampa. The cruise